afternoon, everyone. I'm Chavi, and welcome back to the 10th talk in the Data Science webinar series organized by Manav, the Human Atlas Initiative. Today, we have with us Professor Ajit Kembhavi, who is the Professor Emeritus and former Director at the Inter-University Center for Astronomy and Astrophysics, also known as AYUCA in Pune. And today, he will be talking to us about something very exciting and very new in this series, that is deep learning in astronomy and biology. Professor Kembhavi is a distinguished astronomer who works on galaxies, quasars, and other extragalactic objects in various areas of high-energy astrophysics. He has published many papers in journals and several books in English and Marathi, one of which was awarded the Mahatma Jyoti Rao Phule Award in 2018. Professor Kembhavi is a fellow of the Indian Academy of Sciences and the National Academy of Sciences in India, and has been the leading member for many national and international projects and councils, such as the 30-meter telescope project, LIGO India and USA projects, International Virtual Observatory Alliance, ISRO's APEX Science Board, Space Commission, the International Astronomical Union, and many more. He has also headed a big data project supported by National Knowledge Network. Now, before we start, a message for our audience to please post your questions in the Q&A tab below only, not the chat box, but in the Q&A tab below. And we will take the questions at the end of the seminar. So welcome, Professor Kembhavi, and over to you.
So, good afternoon. It's my great pleasure to give a talk to you people under the auspices of the MANO project based at IISER. I have a little bit of familiarity with it, and I know, of course, many people from IISER and Persistent Systems, and they all been my collaborators. I am very glad to be giving this talk, but I wish that I was standing before all of you to give it, because I find it very disconcerting to not be able to see my audience. So it's like somebody who's giving a musical performance and who can't see who's listening to it. Because you see that it's really difficult to gauge whether what I'm saying is being understood, will be appreciated, or I should be saying something at a different level, because every speaker would like to tune what they say so that there is maximum resonance with the audience. So that pleasure is missing in all these remote talks, but then we can't give up things, and we have to do the best of what we can. So let's go ahead. And you'll have a chance to ask me questions. I'll not be able to hear you asking them, but hopefully you'll hear me. All right, I'm going to be talking to you about artificial intelligence, and in particular, machine learning and deep learning. I'm sure that many of you are familiar with these matters. Many of you are biologists, but even those who do biology need these tools very much. And then they're spreading all over the place, and every sphere of knowledge is being permeated by artificial intelligence. What I'm going to do today is to first tell you, just make some general remarks, and then introduce you to three problems, two from astronomy and one from biology, and say what would be the difficulty in addressing these problems conventionally. Then I will introduce the concepts of machine learning and deep learning, just a superficial introduction to these very difficult subjects, and then I'll show you how each of the three problems which I introduced in the first part of my talk can be very neatly addressed using these techniques. So now, yeah, sorry. Now here you'll find a long list of names. Now, I personally started working in this field quite recently in deep learning. I'd written a couple of papers on machine learning for a 20-year period, but only now I got interested. And I'm very heavily dependent on collaborators, both from who are familiar with the technicalities of these subjects, as well as those who have the domain knowledge. And I'll show you as I go along how both of these are very, very important to have successful applications, successful and believable applications. So in the long list, the list on the left is basically of people who work with me on astronomical problems or collaborate with me, collaborate with each other. And on the right is a set of biologists. And these includes, both these lists include very senior people, and then it includes postdocs, it includes students, young researchers, and it's a great pleasure working with such a large group. Right, so here is a picture of the human brain, and then the brain functions in certain ways. And what artificial intelligence would like to do is to try to reproduce the actions of the brain. Right, so we want to take this marvel of biology and then replace it by a marvel of silicon. Right, so there are all these circuits and there are electrons passing through them, and the idea is to teach such a contraption to solve problems. Now that's a tall order. It's very much into the future, and what we will see are just the beginnings of the beginnings and some successful attempts. So machine learning applications, I know, I'm sure that you have heard of these applications many times. They are there all over the place. So one could start with a very simple problem of, say, optical character recognition. What it means is that I want to be able to recognize the digit 7, let's say, if I write it there. Here I'm just showing a representation of what you call the Arabic numerals, but this could be in any language whatsoever. Then you see that because if you look at any one of these digits, now it could be written in quite different forms, the same basic digit. The human eye and the human brain are capable of recognizing them very easily, but can we teach a machine to do so? Then there's the question of speech recognition, and when you say something to Alexa, Alexa responds. So Alexa is actually recognizing what you say. Facial recognition, which is very, very important, and which has been repeatedly found out dangerous because of incomplete training. Then recognizing images. And recognizing images, for example, would be extremely important when you come to autonomous vehicles. There has been a lot of talk of driverless cars. Okay, so so these are going along the road, and then they see a constantly changing scene, and then they have to react to it and take the passenger safely from one destination, from one place to another. So all of these come under the general rubric of machine learning, and but there are many different techniques of artificial intelligence which need to be applied for solving problems like these. So then, how does one use large data sets scientifically? Right. So here, so the idea is that scientists, they could be astronomers, they could be biologists, they could be physicists, collect a great deal of data. And then at any given point in time, you have techniques to analyze the data. So in the middle of the last millennium, people got logarithmic tables, for example, which became a very important tool. And over a period of time, they invented calculators, and now we have computers, high performance computing. And we would like to analyze data. But what we are trying to do using all these techniques and devices is to find patterns in the data, find correlations, divide out the data into different classes, try to identify outliers, and generally find meaning in the data. So when we want to do all this, what we require is a subject called data analytics. It's just a name there. But what it, in my opinion, what data analytics consists of is when you're working in a particular field, you require domain knowledge. Right, so if I'm writing a paper on applying artificial intelligence to biology, I need to know, or my collaborators need to know in depth the biological issues that we are addressing. It is not a question of simply taking some numbers and fitting a curve to them. So you need domain knowledge. Then you obviously need mathematics for all this, and statistics, because interpretation. Mathematics and statistics, of course, I'm using these terms very broadly, and they encompass a great deal of human knowledge at the basis of all techniques. And then we'll be using visualization all the time, visualize the data in various ways, just plot a graph, for example, or make a contour plot, or look at actually a human face. All that involves visualization, and then we have to do a lot of data mining. And so that means get into the data and then find patterns, correlations, classes, and so forth. And so then today we are going to see how machine learning is used there. So now let's consider, after the general remarks, let's consider three problems, as I said, two in astronomy. I'm fully aware that very few of you would have any serious astronomical knowledge, but nevertheless, I'm beginning with these two problems. One, because I am most familiar with them and can introduce you to the concepts through these problems. And second, astronomy is one subject which really invites attention, which gets attention, and many people are quite familiar with the concepts there. Right, so now here is what is called a galaxy. Now we live in the Milky Way galaxy, but this is an external galaxy, which is called M51. It's very far away, and it is a collection of stars. There are something like 10 raised to 11 to 10 raised to 12 stars. That's 100 billion to 1 trillion stars in a galaxy like this. And then the central part of the galaxy is known as the bulge. And then you can see there is a disk which is not completely apparent. What is apparent are the beautiful spiral arms. So this is what is called a spiral galaxy. Right. So now look at the next slide. So here I have three spiral galaxies. Right. And the three are quite different from each other. These are two spiral galaxies, and this one here in the lower right-hand corner is what is known as a lenticular galaxy. Right, so now in all these three galaxies, you'll see that there is some kind of a linear structure which is completely obvious. And such a linear structure is known as a bar. So if we go back to the image that I started with, you'll see that this galaxy has no bar. So as it turns out, after observing a lot of galaxies, we find that about half the galaxies, maybe 40%, have bars in them. Not all are as obvious as the kind that I've shown you here, but some could be shorter, thinner, fainter. So you really don't know whether the bar is there or not, or is it something else which is emulating a bar. But the bars are very important. They are not just there for the pictures. They are dynamically important, meaning the bars are formed because of the interactions of all the stars in the galaxy among themselves, the gravitational interactions. Once a bar is formed, it funnels gas which is present in the galaxies as well as the stars from the outer regions into the inner regions. And therefore, it brings about the evolution of the galaxy. The bars can exist for something like maybe 100 million years and then disappear. Possibly they are born again. So bars are very important. Understanding bars is very important. So then, and then we need to find whether bigger galaxies have a bigger bar, more bright galaxies have more bigger bar, or galaxies in the distance have bars more often than galaxies close to us, or galaxies which are there in a crowded field, which thousands of galaxies close to them have more often a bar. So you want to carry out research on all these matters, and for that you have to be able to find galaxies which are bars and compare them with galaxies which don't have bars. And traditionally, what astronomers do is that in the old days, they obtained photographs of large portions of the sky, looked for galaxies and counted how many of them have bars. And now you do that with a computer, and you could image process the thing and try to see whether the bar or not. But all the slow processes, even though we know millions of galaxies, tens of millions of galaxies now, we have observed them. There are just a few thousand galaxies where you can reliably say that this galaxy has got a bar and this galaxy doesn't have a bar. Right? So astronomers would be very interested to find bars in large numbers of galaxies, and therefore you clearly need an automatic process. Problem number 2, spectral classification of stars. Now this sounds like a complicated issue, but actually it's very simple. Now look at this cutout of a star like the sun. This is the interior of the sun. On the exterior, you have the photosphere, which is the pale yellow layer of the sun that you see. It's called the photosphere. It's only about 50 kilometers thick, because uh, light from deeper in the sun than 50 kilometers cannot reach us because it's absorbed in that layer. As you go inwards, the sun becomes hotter. In the innermost part are the nuclear reactions going on. Hydrogen is being converted to helium and so forth. A great deal of energy is generated, and the radiation travels outwards. The energy travels outwards. Now, the sun can be considered to be a hot ball of matter, and therefore it will be emitting radiation in what is known as a black body spectrum. But as the radiation passes through the sun, it eventually reaches the outer layers, which are cool. The inner layers, the innermost part, the temperature is 20 million Kelvin. And then it drops to about 6,000 Kelvin at the surface of the sun. Now, when in the interiors, when everything is very, very hot, all the atoms are ionized completely. But as you go outwards, in the photosphere, the temperature is low enough that there are different ionic species, right? So not all the electrons are stripped from the atom. And when you have got different ionic species, these can absorb the radiation which is coming in and produce what are known as absorption lines. So if I look at the spectrum of the sun, which Newton studied for the first time ever, then you'll see this beautiful spectrum there. You know, there's all Vibgyor and so on, like in the rainbow. Start with violet and go on to the blue. And this is, when you go down the redder colors, the wavelength increases. So now, what we are particularly interested in is, apart from this continuous spectrum, these dark lines that you see on it. These are the absorption lines. So I remember I said that as the radiation from the hotter parts of the sun passes through the cooler parts, it gets absorbed. And where the absorption occurs, which lines appear, depend upon the composition of the sun, the chemical composition of the sun, what is the ionic state of the sun, and therefore what is the temperature, what is the pressure, what is the acceleration due to gravity, and so forth. Now here is a digital version of the spectrum. So you see that this red line is simply a transcription of the spectrum that you see here. On the x-axis, I've got wavelength, and on the y-axis, I have intensity. And this black line is what you call the black body spectrum, the Planck spectrum, corresponding to a temperature, which is the temperature of the surface of the sun, about 6,000 Kelvin. Right, so you see that the real spectrum is quite close to a black body spectrum, except that it has got all these absorption lines. Right? So now what happens? I mean, do all stars have the same spectrum? That's not true. It was discovered starting with the final decades of the 19th century. People first saw absorption lines early in the 19th century, but they started collecting a lot of data later in the 19th century and then in the 20th century. So you see here, the spectrum comes from different kinds of stars, which are labeled because of historical reasons as O, B, A, F, and so on. And then you see that this particular line here is, the absorption line is very dark there, and then it disappears as you go down. Right? So, and so on and so forth. So there are different kinds of spectra, and which I put them in digital form. So you see here the digital spectra, and then here you got this is hydrogen delta, hydrogen gamma, and so on, H beta. All these lines, you can see the lines on here. Here's the line of magnesium, and so forth. Now, you'll see the temperature is the highest in this spectrum, and it goes down there. Now, there are a lot of people worked on classifying the spectra, trying to find patterns in them. And what they discovered was that there could be seven main classes of spectra, which I said because of historical reasons are given these letters, which don't mean anything specific now. And then each one of these is divided into subclasses depending upon details of the spectrum. And then there are what are called 5 luminosity classes. Because you see that stars like the sun are called dwarfs, because the size is quite small by astronomical standards. But when the sun finishes its sphere, when it evolves, it will become a red giant, will be much, much larger. So class 1 are the red giants, and the giant stars, and class 5 are the dwarfs. So there are 3 other classes in between, with total of 5 classes. So how many do I have then? I got 7 into 10 is 70, and into 5 is 350. So what I would like to do is that if somebody shows me a spectrum, and I should be able to say, my God, this is a star of the type K5. You see here, it is K05. So how do astronomers do that? They're experts who can just look at the spectrum and say what type it is, quite accurately. But then we don't have experts all over the place. And experts can classify 100 stars, 1,000 stars. They cannot classify a billion stars. And that is the kind of data that we have now. So what I would like to do is to teach a machine to do that. I could do that, there are straightforward ways in which I could do it, but I want to find a clever way of using machine learning to do that. All right. Then the third problem, protein identification in 2D images. Now, I know very little about these matters because I work with all these wonderful biologists, and they do the heavy lifting. And we, astronomer types or physics types, we just are there with the analysis. But then slowly we are developing understanding and to see and into the beautiful subject of biology. So when I was wanted to do my PhD, I got admission to the Tata Institute of Fundamental Research, and in those days, molecular biology was very much in fashion. Very fashionable for physicists to turn to molecular biology. So I couldn't decide whether I should be able to do molecular biology or should I do astronomy. And I met Professor Maitra, who was a very well-known molecular biologist in TIFR. And then he explained to me what would be involved in molecular biology. I liked it very much. And then I asked him whether I could do it half and half, do both during my PhD. And he said, first you work on one subject and then we'll see about 2 subjects. And so then I decided to go to astronomy. All right, so now I have chosen a problem. We have been working on 2 or 3 problems. I have chosen a problem which is the most understandable to me. So here the protein molecule, RNA polymerase 3, and you can see its structure here. There are all kinds of complexities in the structure. This is a 3-dimensional structure. Now, it has got very microscopic structure, and then you're not going to be able to see it in 3 dimensions. You're going to see it as an image in a microscope. Right, so you'll see a 2D structure. Right, so now because these are proteins are 3-dimensional. If I, depending on the orientation of a line of sight, I can get a completely different picture of the protein. So if I hold it up in 3 dimensions, I should be able to walk around, look at it from the top, bottom, left, right, left, and so on, and then look at what its structure is like. But now, you see, I don't see the 3-dimensional structure. I cannot go around it. And what I actually do is I use electron microscopes. You can see here the scales over which these work. Electron microscopes, and then or nanometers, 100 nanometers, 0.1 nanometers, and then what I see is an image like this, which is quite unexciting. It doesn't look like anything like the 3-dimensional structure that we want to understand. So you see that this is a SEM or TM, I've forgotten which one, protein image. And then you see that there's small little green things here, the gray things here. And there are, when you see a structure here, it could either be the ice which is holding the thing together, or it could be carbon, which is impurity there, or it could be the protein. And what I'm interested is in trying to find proteins here. And how would a biologist do it? A trained biologist look at it and say, these are protein, these are protein, these are protein, these are protein. So the biologist would get that right many times, quite often, get it wrong sometimes. But it doesn't matter. So then you collect together these 2D images of the protein. And this is just one single protein molecule. And then one single protein. And then you collect the 2D images. You put them all together. And then, because you see that you're looking at them in different orientations, it is like holding it in 3-dimensional space and walking around it. except that instead of walking around it, you look at the differently projected images of these proteins. You collect them together, and then you follow this method here. So you see that you've got a sample, you make a grid in a plate, and then you observe it in the electron microscope, and here you've got the gray image that I showed you, and then you are looking at particles with different alignments in space, and then you can use all the projections to construct a 3D map of the solid, and then from there you make the model. Because the map itself is not enough, you need to know what are the different kinds of molecules which are present there, and then so on and so forth, and then you get the 3D structure that you wanted in all its detail. So this is what we want to do. My idea today is not to explain to you how that is done, but just to say a technique for painless but reasonably accurate method to identify which of these gray particles that you see here are actually the protein molecules. I mean, as I already said, a trained biologist will look at it and decide which of them, but it is not enough for you to look at one single electron micrograph like this. What you need to do is to analyze thousands and thousands and thousands of images. So clearly it will be a very, very slow process. And what you want to do is to get a sophisticated way of doing that quickly and reliably. Right. So now after that introduction and after looking at problems which we want to solve, now I finally come down to the core ideas here, and that is machine learning and deep learning. Right. So what is the principle behind this? See, what we would like to do is the following. We would like to construct a machine. Now, in the old days, people actually physically constructed the machine and connected up various things, and then they trained it to carry out certain tasks. That was horrendously complicated because the simplest tasks would require very large machines. Now, this is just an algorithm. The computer on which it works can be quite complex. Now, right now, we are running a certain algorithm for what is known as image deconvolution, and it is working on the high performance computing cluster in IUCAA, which has got some 4,500 nodes and so on. It's a very complex structure. But the program, the thing is not the important is not the machine. We could as well run it on a laptop. It will just take longer, but the laptop can very well serve the purpose. So what is important is the algorithm. So we have got an algorithm, which means a program written in Python, say, or Fortran, or whatever you like. So we've got an algorithm. And then what we do is that we take the data, and in this very simple scheme, you know what is known as supervised learning, meaning that let's say that I got pictures of dogs and cats mixed together, and I want I want to be able to, when I take a unknown picture, I want to train a machine on these pictures, so that then I say that these are dog, look at the picture, these are cat, look at the picture, and give it enough sufficient number of samples in the training. And then what you do is that then you show it. Once it is trained, you show it a picture and say, is this a dog or is this a cat? So what we need is that we need data with labels, pictures which say whether it's a cat or a dog. We need the algorithm. And then we train the thing, then we have got what is known as a trained model. The trained model is tested on test data, right? So where I know whether it's a cat or a dog, and then it is tested, I give it 100 pictures and see whether it comes out with the correct answer. If it is just 50%, that means nothing. So it could 90%, 95%, 99%. That's very important. I have to look at what is the accuracy and what is the completeness with which it does this. I'll describe these things. So this is the general scheme. So now let us take a very specific, very simple example. Right? Let's suppose that we have got two kinds of objects, and these are blue crosses and red dashes. The shape is not important, the color is not important. What is important is that in this space of x1 and x2, meaning there's an x1 axis and x2 axis, there's just coordinates. The blues occupy this position and the reds occupy this position. So I know the coordinates. Now, supposing somebody gives me an object and says that the coordinates of that object in this diagram are x1 and x2. It is a blue, does it belong to the blue class or does it belong to the red class? So this is the problem that we want to solve. Two kinds of objects. So now this is a very, very simple problem. What I could do is draw a straight line like this. Right? I'm not passing it to the reds, I'm not passing it to the blues. I'm passing it to a space between the two. And then I will say that you give me any object and I will see whether it is at the right of the line, then I say it is blue. It is left of the line, then I'll see it is red. As simple as that. But what is my algorithm for saying whether it is on the right of the line or the left of the line? Could it be simpler? You know that in 2 dimensions, a line has got a very simple equation. It is what? W1 plus x, W1 into x1 plus W2 into x2 plus W3 is equal to 0. I have now written that expression in a vector form. Right, so now this is the normal to the line. So what happens is that supposing now this is my vector. Now it turns out that give me an object, tell me what are its coordinates. Then if I find that w dot x is greater than 0, then the object is to the right. And w dot x is less than 0, then the object is to the left and it is a red object. Right? So you see how simple it is. So what is involved here? I have to find a line. Clearly the line is not unique. I could place the line anywhere. So now imagine I am now trying to write an algorithm for solving this problem. So what would I do? I will say, if I'm doing it visually, I will start with a line like this, and then they'll say this line is not good enough because some blue objects are to the left, some blue objects are to the right. So then I rotate the line, I move the line, and finally I get something like the dashed line that you see in the figure. Right? But supposing I want to do it mathematically, what would I do? So I choose somewhere W1, W2, W3. What it means is that I'm just taking a trial line, and then I will see how many, does this line separate the objects? Are all blue objects on one side or all red objects on the other side? If they are not, I change my W vector. Right, so I'll go on doing that until I get the correct answer. What do you mean by the correct answer? The correct answer is the one which ideally would classify all objects correctly. But you know that's never going to happen, though it is possible in this simple figure. But ideally, I would like to find that line which leads to minimum loss. Minimize loss, meaning what? That, that wrongly classified objects are as few as possible. So how do I do that using a machine? So this machine can be a program, as I already expect. This is not the artificial neuron because people actually built it in the hardware when they first started deep in the last century. So you see that instead of 2 dimensions, I got n dimensions here. And then, and these are all the data points which are coming in. So I'll have a large number of objects where these are correctly labeled using these data points, and then I build an algorithm for that. Right? So this shows you how you do that. I'll not go into it. And this is what you know the loss function, and this gives you the thing for minimizing the loss function. And the end product you see here. So this is actually a program that Kaushal Sharma ran for me, where we start with the red and blue objects, and then he followed, he wrote a program, or he used one of the any large number of neural network things which are available and codes which are available, and he got this line. And you see that the accuracy reaches 100%. We should not say much. We could have done that simply by plain trial and error, right? But now let us consider. So what did we do here? We had a single neuron with this coming in, and there's an output. And if the output is greater than 0, it is blue, and output is less than 0, it is red. And so now let us go to a slightly more complicated problem. You see that you now have these 3 groups of objects here. And then now clearly no single line is going to let me separate these objects properly. I could have a line here separating these two and this one, a line here separating these two and this one. But how do I, how can I separate it? You can show, it's obvious, but you can prove that it's not a kind of thing which can be separated by a single line. And what we require to separate them is multiple lines, as shown in this picture. And how do I achieve those multiple lines? You see that I had a single neuron, which was enough to give me one equation. And what are that equation? That it was the equation of that line. But now I want 3 different lines, as you see here. And so therefore, I need a larger number of neurons. And how do we do that? So you see that here there could be 2 coordinates, 3 coordinates, 10 coordinates, it doesn't matter. But the outputs in the present case are of 3 kinds, because I got 3 coordinates and I got 3 groups. So 3 outputs: group A, group B, group C, group red, group blue, group green, doesn't matter. And I need to introduce one more layer of neurons here, which is known as a hidden layer, because this layer of neurons, the middle layer, is not interacting directly with the outside world, nor is it saying anything to the outside world. It only talks internally to the other layers of neurons. So you see that this becomes a 3-layer network. And I need, because I want 3 lines. Now the question is it very straightforward? I want 5 lines, do I need a 5-layer network? That is not true. Right? I can simply, by increasing the number of neurons, I could get 5 different lines. All right, so I got it here. So which means that this technique is working properly. And what you may like to know is that it took a very, very long time for people to get to this level. Because they first did the 2 classes, and then somebody said that you can't do the 3 classes, and mathematical theorems proved, and so on. So it took a very long time. Let us start and stop over the decades. Now let us go to a more complicated problem. What do I have here? I got red and blue, 2 classes, but you see that these are now entwined together like this. So which means that I can't pass a straight line. 3 straight lines will be enough. It's clear that I could have a large number of straight lines, right? Broken straight lines. But what about having a curve? That would be the elegant solution. But a curve is non-linear, meaning a straight line, as you know, is a linear object. Ax1 plus bx2 is equal to 0. But if I got a parabola like y is equal to x square, a circle, x squared plus y squared is equal to 1, it's non-linear, and that is what you want here. Right? I want to pass a curve through it. So how do I do that? It turns out that, first of all, the output of each neuron must be non-linear. And very simple kind of non-linearity can be introduced. Right? And then, so you see that I introduced a non-linearity like this, it's a straight line. I'm not going to that, just remember non-linearity. And then I got a 3-layer network with non-linearity in it. And what have I done? You see that I generated this curve. Right? It nicely separates the 2 classes. So you'll say, so then what are the new things here? One is that we needed to make the neurons non-linear. That's very important. And the second most profound thing that is for you to learn and understand is that I did not give the network the equation of the curve. You see that when you fit a straight line to your data, what do? You start with the equation of the curve and you only vary the parameters. When you want to fit a circle, you start with the equation of the curve, equation of a circle, and vary the radius of the circle and the center of the circle. Here, the beautiful thing about machine learning, these kind of neural networks, is that I don't have to give it this curve. That is why it is called learning. What it does is that it starts with these points. I only have to say that these points are class 1, these points are class 2, give it to them. It will try different curves by itself, and then it will give the answer. When it gives the answer, it is not going to give you the equation of the curve. What is the answer? The answer is a trained network. And then I give the trained network a new point and it will tell me where it is. Right? So you see here an animation, again done by Kaushal. So you see that there are different, this is called tan, tells you what kind of non-linearity, that this tells you how many total number of neurons which is present there. And you see that you're getting different solutions depending on different kinds of neurons. Some solutions work, some solutions don't work. Right? So now just one last bit here in machine learning. They're called artificial neural networks, ANN. You see what we have here is the red and the blue points are mixed together. Right? So now I could pass, what do I do now? Can I pass a circle? Can I pass a surface curve through each of these points? See, for example, here, you'll see that there's very complicated curve here passing through this. Now, when you get these more and more complicated classifications, then typically it means that they are artificial. They are of no use to anybody. You need to find simple patterns. And if you are a domain expert, you'll say that, look, it is not that this curve is so complicated. It is that the red points and the blue points have moved from their real positions because of errors. And so we have to take into account errors, and we have to say that, look, you don't try to fit every point, because if you fit every point, what would happen? There's an example of that here. So you see that this green line is a sine curve, and the points that you see are from the sine curve. And these points, so these are the experimental points sitting along the curve. And somebody has tried to fit a straight line to it. Obviously, it's not a good fit. Someone else has tried to fit a third-degree polynomial, which really reproduces the sine curve pretty well. But in this figure here, which is the the third figure, so you'll see, though I can't see because I'm getting covered by this small thing on my screen. So you'll see that the red line is passing through every point. This is a high degree polynomial. It's a 9-degree polynomial. There are 9 points. So is it meaningful? It is not, because I know that the real solution is a green one. So therefore, what I did in achieving at the red result is that I overfitted. I passed it through all the points by making the fit very complicated. And that is what can happen in machine learning. You have to watch out. You have to make sure that you are doing things correct. And for that, you need to really have domain knowledge. All right. Now let us come to deep learning. Now see that there are two things. There's one aspect that I did not bring out properly here because the kind of example that I considered is you see that the coordinates x1 and x2 were were the attributes of the object. Now, supposing instead of doing a classification like that, I have tried to do machine learning, and I teach it to classify pictures. Now, you see that the image detector in your even your less expensive cell phones can have millions of pixels. Right, so if you had, now supposing I take a lot of images and try to classify them, then each one of these pixels would become an input. So I got 1 million inputs. So when I try to build a neural network like that for a very large amount of data, 1 million network, so what would happen is that I would come to a network like this. You can imagine instead of the 5.5 billion points here, and then the hidden layers, and these are the things which tells me what kind of an image it is: cat, dog, horse, car. Then you see that there'll be literally hundreds of millions of connections between them, and then it'll be impossible to do anything practical with it. Right, so these kind of multi-layer networks reach their limits of computability and reach the limits of practicality. So now then what do? You don't lose heart, you develop new techniques. And that new technique is deep learning. So when do you have a deep learning? When do you say that a machine learning, you pass from machine learning to deep learning? You can say when the number of data points is very large, when the number of nodes is very large, and the number of layers which are required to solve the problem also becomes very large, becomes large, 3 layers, 5 layers, 7 layers, 9 layers, so that machine learning becomes impractical. So what is it that deep learning does? So one particular deep learning framework is what is known as a convolutional neural network. So look at how would you detect a human face? What I could do, either I could take an image, a CCD image, and there'll be many pixels. And then I would treat each pixel as independent and try to teach the network how to identify the face. But does our brain do it like that? Our brain doesn't do it like that. So when you see a face, you see the person's eyes, you see the person's nose, you see the person's mouth, you see the person's hair, and then your brain is classifying them into a certain pattern. So now, in strict machine learning, if I took all the pixels which define a face and then jumble them together and give them for the training, still the training would go through. The point is that, again, coming back to the human brain, if you give it a jumble of the pixels which constitute the image, it can't recognize what it is. So the human brain is looking for patterns, and that is what a convolutional neural network does. It takes an image like this of a dog, and then it will pass the image through certain filters. And that filter breaks it up into verticals and horizontals and other kind of structures. You can see them here in the next slide. So you see that this one uses filters which detect edges. You see that the leg is an edge on one side of the leg, and then you've got the curves, you've got the textures, and then you've got the appearance. Right? So finally, you break it down into all these parts, pick out the most important pixels, reduce the data, so you're encoding the image to manageable size, and then you use your usual classification methods to classify it. So that is known as a convolutional neural network. Right? So you see here, you've got an example of it. So there's a car here. Here is a train network. And the network is expected to classify it either as a car or a truck or an airplane or a ship or a horse. Right? And then these are all the convolutional layers. You see that it is being broken up into constituents of the image, and then the whole image has been given to it. And then what is the net result here? You see that the green bars show what is the probability. So clearly the probability for the car is the highest for this picture. So you've got a right answer. Right? So now here is a specific architecture which are used for detect bars. So you've got all the convolutional layers and you've got the nonlinearities and so forth. All right. So now with that very brief and very incomplete introduction, let me come to classification of these galaxies. So what have we done? So we considered deep learning network, and then I choose an appropriate network using my knowledge of network theory. Then I need images, and of how many images do I need? For typical convolutional neural networks, you would require 30, 40, 50,000 images. You don't have them. Even though I got images of millions of galaxies, there are only a few thousand galaxies which are reliably classified as bars and no bars. So what do? I do what is known as image augmentation, meaning I can use rotated images of the galaxies. I'll not go into that. Right? So then I take these thousands of images, and you see some sample images here. So on the left part of the figure has got galaxies without bars, and the right part of the figure is galaxies with bars. So you take a convolutional neural network like this, and then you show it each image, and you say whether it is barred or unbarred until it gets trained. How do you know it is trained? Because you can see that the loss function has been minimized, and then you use a test set. What's a test set? Uh, you take galaxies where you know whether they have a bar or not, but which have not been used in the training. And then you classify this test set using your trained network, and you see in what fraction these come out to be correct. Right? So then you get what is known as a confusion matrix. So here in this part, so you see that this matrix has got is a 2 by 2 matrix, and these are all the barred galaxies in a vertical. Barred galaxies classified as barred, 1100. Barred galaxies classified as unbarred, just 173. Right? So what will be the accuracy? The accuracy is that you take the total number which have been classified. These are barred galaxies been classified as unbarred, so you're wrong there. So this is what is called a false negative, right? And then here, unbarred galaxies have been classified as unbarred, but here unbarred galaxies have been classified as barred. So this is what is called a false positive. So when you compare the how many false positives you had, how many false negatives, then we see that our accuracy is 95%. What does this mean? Is that you start with a barred galaxy, you give it a galaxy, and ask the network whether it's barred or unbarred. It will come out with an answer, and you can trust the answer to 95%. Meaning that in today's world, what would you be doing? A patient gets to the hospital, and artificial neural network examines the patient and says that whether the patient is COVID positive or COVID negative. And you need good accuracy in that, because when the person is not positive, when the person is classified as positive, then the person will be in quarantine for 2 weeks. All is not lost. But when the person actually is COVID positive, but you classify that person as COVID negative, then that person could become seriously ill before you take that person to hospital. Right? So that's so false positives and false negatives, they both have their implications. Now, spectral classification of stars. So you see that I already told you about the spectra, and then you what we want to do is to train a network to classify these. We again go to a CNN, that means a convolutional neural network, but there's a twist in the tail. So in the 3 examples, the first one was more straightforward. The second one, what is the twist here? The first one, the data was 2-dimensional, because an image, as you know, is 2-dimensional, but the spectrum is 1-dimensional. So again, as usual, I got just a few thousand correctly identified spectra, and I rotated the images to augment my data, but here I can't rotate a 1-dimensional thing. So what do? You use a marvelous device which is known as an autoencoder. I find this really, really very elegant. Let's see what it does very quickly. So you have here this part of it to the left part of the figure is what is known as the encoder. So I give it a spectrum, and then it uses the principles of convolutional neural networks in 1 dimension to break up that spectrum into its features, and it produces a coded version of the spectrum. Now what do? This same exact arrangement, I reverse it on the right of the figure. So I pass a spectrum here, the spectrum gets encoded into a small number of elements, and here the exact opposite arrangement decodes it. So what will I have on the right? At right I will have the same spectrum, whatever went in came out. So you say what has been achieved? What has been achieved is something very nice, is that I have trained it to decipher the spectrum and reconstruct it again. Now imagine doing it for 100 spectra simultaneously. So I give spectrum 1, 2, 3, 4 like that. It cannot, and if it is successful, it will not be able to reproduce all the spectra. But then you see, it will give an overall representation with minimum loss. Okay, meaning that it trains itself so that a majority of the spectra, a large number of the spectra, would come out correctly decoded. Okay, so you encode it, you decode it. They'll be correctly reproduced. So what is the point? Now look at it this way. I have only a few thousand spectra to do the training, but those are not enough for my deep learning approach. What I do is that I use autoencoders, and I give it 50,000 spectra, which are similar to the ones I'm using for classification, but which are not classified. And then the autoencoder learns to interpret this spectra. Once it has done that, the coding is all included here. It has learned how to code the spectra. What I do now is to remove this part and put a classifier there. Right? Remove this part and put a classifier there. And you see that here is the encoder and here's the decoder. Now the decoder is removed and a classifier is put. And that is enough to do the classification. So we did that. And here you'll see a diagram where the correct class is on the x-axis, the predicted class is on the right axis, and clearly you see that there is nice, very nice reproduction of the data. And you see here that here again you see that the fact that they are lying on the diagonal means that there's correct classification. So is it of use to anybody? So there's a very practical example of use that I'll provide you. We wrote this paper. It's a long, highly technical paper. And then we sent it for publication and it got accepted. And then we uploaded the paper into the archives. We did that in the morning about 6 months ago. And in the afternoon, I got a message from a very, very senior German astronomer whom I have known very well in the past. He said that, look, you people have produced this, you have got a classifier for spectra, automatic classifier spectra. That is exactly what I'm looking for. So why was he looking for this? Because he has been one of the people who have developed a really marvelous new instrument, which classifies, which collects thousands and thousands of spectra very quickly. And they needed to classify those. And our neural network was very, very satisfying to them. So now we are collaborating with them on their problems. All right. Now, in the few minutes left to me, I'll come to the particle picking problem. So you see what you have here, I remind you of the images that I showed you, is that this is a electron micrograph, and then you have got these three kinds of particles here, the ice and the carbon and the protein, and we want to identify which are the protein images. And you see that if a human would identify it like this, that the structures enclosed in these red circles, which I'm sure you'll be able to see with the protein. But very similar structures like that are not proteins. And how does the biologist know that? The biologist knows that because of the biologist's experience. So the biologists have domain knowledge. They've seen these proteins many times before. They've seen these micrographs before, and they know what these proteins look like. But it's clearly going to be a very painful process. And then particularly if you're talking about tens of thousands of these graphs, and then there's going to be error prone. However experienced the biologist is, there's errors which will be made. So then biologists from the National Center for Cell Science, Professor Janesh Kumar and Radha Chauhan and their postdocs and their students, we worked with them on this problem, Sajid Philip from Kerala and his group. And then we developed this algorithm which says that here is the file that you get, the data file of the kind that we have seen. And the idea was to enhance the images and then to label them. Okay, meaning that you go through a certain number of images, you first enhance the visibility, and then you say that these are protein, these are protein, these are protein. And then you use a technique. I told you that each one of these examples uses a different technique. It is known as semantic segmentation, which is the training for this is done using these labels which have been put here by biologists. So what does semantic segmentation do? You see this picture here is that now this is just a street scene, and then this has been given to the segmenter. It has been trained to do this thing, and you see that it has painted the cars as blue, the fence as orange, and the people as red, and this is gray and so forth. How do they know how to do it? Because it has been trained to do it. The important thing is that you'll see that all the edges and things have been taken care of very well. So that is the semantic segmentation technique. So how do we apply it here? Is that you see, first you start with this micrograph, and then these are the image enhancement has been done, there is stand out, and then there are different kinds of particles here. But using semantic segmentation, the protein particles, okay, have been they have been labeled as red. Once they're labeled as red, it's very easy for you to pick them out and say these are particles, these are particles, these are particles. Okay, and then you can use them, for the processing. But what is the important question here? What what is the accuracy that you're getting? And so ours is the first method which uses uh, sophisticated CNNs, convolutional neural networks, to solve this problem. And then here you see that the earlier attempt different techniques which I cannot go into. And then what you find is that here the accuracy is 93.5%, is 75.8%, and here we have got a much higher accuracy. You don't see it here. The next one been covered by this. So you see that the 96% accuracy. So even increasing the accuracy by a few percent makes it very important, right? So you see here, the results I'm showing you are a bit outdated. A significant amount of work has been done, and Anshul Asiya and Blessed George and others are writing the paper, which is being very close to finished. But the COVID situation has delayed matters, but we should be able to get better numbers very soon. So I will stop there.
Okay.
And so thank you very much. And I come to the end of my lecture. And I did, as I explained to you, I started off with general principles. Then I explained to you 3 problems that we would like to solve, mentioned to you 3 problems like to solve. Then I introduced the concepts of the AI concept that I used, and I showed how the same problems could be solved using them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. I think that that structure that you put to your talk really helped even me to like understand and really gain a lot from the talk. We have time for a couple of questions. Before I come to those, there's a small thing I want to ask. I think there was a very important component that I found in your talk, which was about the collaboration between the domain and the technical part and I believe that working with the images from the galaxies probably also require international collaborations. So could you reflect a little bit and tell our viewers that the importance and the value that such collaborations bring and how important things are.
So you see what you said really, the fact that these are national and international collaborations. So first of all, remote working. Right now we are all forced to work remotely, and as I said, I find that a bit disconcerting. But on the other hand, the large group of people that I showed you is dispersed not only within Pune, but across the boundaries of states in India, and several of those people are located abroad at any given time. Right, so this is a collaboration. Another important element is that it is a collaboration between biologists and astronomers. So the fact that we are astronomers is incidental, but you should call us, let us say, physicists. So we have our own techniques and ways of looking at things. Biologists have their own ways of looking at things. The point is that the unifying bit here is the machine learning part. The fact that a technique like that goes across domains, and that is a very important idea. And I find that that leads to much better understanding of the things to me. And the fact that you can collaborate across domains is very important and very satisfying. But I'll go further and say that it is also extremely necessary. So right now, for example, in Pune, under the auspices of a still to exist structure called the Pune Knowledge Cluster, we have got a COVID-19 group, which consists of people who are they are medical doctors, other medical professionals, they are virologists, other kinds of biologists, and then there are people like me who are astronomers, physicists, and then there are mathematicians and statisticians. Okay, and then there are chemists, right? So then they're all working together to understand this terrible thing. And we have been quite successful at producing results and then making recommendations to the Pune Municipal Corporation and so forth. So it's a very clear example of a completely cross-domain collaboration set up in situation of great urgency, and which has very happily been able to produce useful results.
I have time to take a couple of audience questions. I'll start with this one, where the student is asking, can we identify a mutated protein using the ML techniques you show? And can we spot the mutation at the exact location in the structure?
Absolutely. Unfortunately, I can't say too much about that because my understanding is very poor. So every time we have a discussion, the young biologists who are there, they train me momentarily on what the issue is, and as soon as they leave, I forget it again. But we have specifically been working on this kind of a structure thing. And there's a paper which I will send out to Chavi, and if she likes, I'll send a link to you because it's a published, very recently published paper. It's on the archives, and it will give an example of the kind of application that you have in mind.
Okay, wonderful. So students want to understand a little bit more about the bars that are used in Galaxy, the use of these bars in the galaxies, and the second is if we look at galaxies from different dimensions, not so that from one dimension it would look flat, and from the other dimension it would look bar shaped, and would a different dimension not remove the picture of this bar?
Yes. So I will not answer the first question, more about bars. I'll be glad to answer it, but then you'll have to listen to me over 10 lectures. And so, and that is after I introduce you to astronomy. So unfortunately, there's no time for that. But on the other hand, looking at the galaxies from different directions, that's a very, very important question. You see, these objects are very far away, right? So the kind of galaxy that I showed, the nearest big galaxy to us is 2.2 million light years away. That's which is the Andromeda Nebula. And then the galaxies are what you could call absolutely the edge of the universe. Now the point is that they're all so far away that you are only seeing the projections. Just like you are seeing the projections of the protein particles, you are seeing the projections of the galaxies. And then now here we pick different kinds of proteins, and then we sort of did not. No, I'm sorry. We use many images of the same protein, which are giving you different projections. Right, and then you do different projections, and then we are using that to construct a 3D map of the galaxy. Astronomers do exactly that because we observe a large number of galaxies, and then we use the different projections because one galaxy is oriented this way, one galaxy is oriented that way to produce a three-dimensional structure. But there's a critical difference. As biologists, as physicists working in the laboratory, you have control on your sample. Right? You can design the sample different way, different media, different kinds, all sorts of things. But our objects are hundreds of millions of light years away. We have absolutely no control on them. So it's a purely observational science, which makes the techniques quite different.
So there are two questions where students want to know about the artificial neuron and about the hidden neurons. A little bit more clarity. I'm not sure. Can we take that question?
Yes, no problem. So you see, a neuron is a component in the brain. Okay, so and then it is a neuron which mixes messages which come in. So as I told you that when people started thinking about it, they were trying to reproduce these neurons in their functionality. That is why it was called an artificial neuron, right? Which is really a very simple unit, as opposed to the very complex biological neuron. But symbolically, they thought it was a neuron. They decided to treat it like a neuron. That is why we call it artificial. Now that thing is completely gone, but we still maintain the language. What was the other question? The hidden neurons, the hidden layer. You see, there is just the first layer to the left of my pictures were the ones which collect together the signal from the outside. Because when I said this particle has coordinates x1 and x2, I had to put those into the network. Right? So that is the first layer which I am talking to. Then the last layer is the one which says it is red or is it blue. So that is going to tell me, for example, I could set it up so that I actually speak in the thing, saying that x1 is 1, x2 2, like that. x1 is 0.5, x2 is 0.7. So that's the input that I'm providing, which I can provide in the audio. And then I could get arrange the hardware so it blurs out red, blue, red, blue, like that. But then the processing which goes on inside is in layers which are not talking to us directly. They're only talking about themselves. So that is why they are called hidden layers.
Okay, I think I'll stop here. The questions, Dr. Kembhavi. Thanks a lot. Really, many thanks. We have so many questions which represents the great participation from the audience, and I'm sure everybody was very excited and very interested in what they were learning from you. So on behalf of the entire Manav team, I thank you for your talk today.
Thank you very much. It's been my pleasure.
Thank you, sir. And I would also like to thank the outreach team at Manav for organizing this data science webinar series. The team will shortly reach out to all the attendees regarding the feedback for article that Professor Kembhavi has mentioned. So for our upcoming events, please watch out on the social media of the Manav channel. Somebody asked about the recordings of these, and they are available on the YouTube channel that we have. So you can always go back and learn in case you missed something. So thank you, sir, and thank you everybody, and stay safe.
Bye.